The morning mist hung heavy over the grounds of Ashworth Palace, as Queen Consort Isabella made her way through the marble corridors toward the east wing. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with purposeful determination, echoing through the vast hallways adorned with portraits of generations past. The palace staff bowed respectfully as she passed, but Isabella barely acknowledged them. Her mind was consumed with a singular focus that had been gnawing at her for weeks. The relationship between Isabella and Princess Catherine had always been strained. From the moment Prince Alexander had announced his engagement to the commoner-turned-princess, Isabella had viewed Catherine as an outsider who didn't belong in their world of ancient traditions and royal protocols. But what started as mere disapproval had evolved into something far more sinister over the past months. Isabella had noticed the way King Edmund looked at Catherine during state functions, the subtle nods of approval he gave her suggestions during council meetings, and most importantly, the increasing frequency with which he consulted her on matters of state. It was becoming clear that Catherine was gaining influence within the royal household, and Isabella saw this as a direct threat to her own position and that of her son, Prince Marcus, from her previous marriage. The East Wing housed the royal archives and administrative offices, areas that were typically restricted to senior members of the royal family and trusted advisors. Isabella had discovered through careful observation that Catherine often visited these areas, claiming to research historical precedents for various charitable initiatives she was championing. But Isabella suspected there was more to these visits than met the eye. As she approached the archive section, Isabella's personal assistant, Lady Margaret Thornfield, appeared at her side. Margaret had served the royal family for over 2 decades and was known for her unwavering loyalty and discretion. She was one of the few people Isabella trusted completely, and their relationship had evolved beyond that of employer and employee to something resembling genuine friendship. "Your Majesty," Margaret whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "I've confirmed what we suspected. Princess Catherine has been accessing files from the succession archives." The head archivist, Lord Pemberton, showed her documents dating back 3 generations yesterday afternoon. Isabella's jaw tightened. The succession archives contained sensitive information about royal lineages, inheritance laws, and most crucially, documentation regarding the legitimacy of various claims to the throne. For Catherine to be accessing these files without proper authorization suggested she might be researching ways to strengthen her own position, or that of her future children in the line of succession. "Did Lord Pemberton question her access?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He did express some concern, but apparently Princess Catherine claimed she had spoken with King Edmund about it." "Pemberton didn't feel it was his place to challenge her further," Margaret replied. This revelation confirmed Isabella's worst fears. If Catherine was indeed working with King Edmund to research succession laws, it could mean they were planning changes that might affect Prince Marcus's position. As Isabella's son from her first marriage to the late Duke of Westmore, Marcus held a significant place in the current line of succession, but his position could be vulnerable if new precedents were established. Isabella had spent years carefully cultivating her influence within the royal court. After her first husband's death in a tragic hunting accident, her marriage to the then Prince Edmund had been seen as a strategic alliance that brought together 2 of the kingdom's most powerful noble houses. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that Marcus would maintain his place in the succession even after Alexander's marriage to Catherine. The thought of Catherine potentially undermining years of careful political maneuvering filled Isabella with a cold rage. She had already observed how Catherine had managed to win over several key members of the royal council with her charm and apparent sincerity. The princess had a natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life, something that Isabella had always found challenging despite her royal breeding. "We need more information," Isabella decided. "I want to know exactly which documents she accessed and what she might have discovered. Can we arrange for you to speak privately with one of the junior archivists? Someone who might have assisted her and would be willing to share details?" Margaret nodded. "I believe young Thomas Hartwell might be receptive. He's ambitious and understands the importance of maintaining good relationships with all members of the royal family." As they continued their conversation, neither woman noticed the figure watching them from behind a tapestry at the far end of the corridor. Captain William Blackwood, head of the Royal Guard, had been making his morning security rounds when he overheard their hushed discussion. A decorated military officer who had served the royal family faithfully for 15 years, William had always prided himself on staying above the political intrigues that occasionally surfaced within the palace walls. However, what he had just witnessed troubled him deeply. As head of the royal guard, William had sworn an oath to protect all members of the royal family equally. The idea that one royal family member might be conducting surveillance on another went against everything he believed about his duty and the honor of his position. William had always respected Princess Catherine. Unlike some royals who treated the staff with casual indifference, Catherine made an effort to learn the names of guards, servants, and other palace employees. She had personally thanked him on several occasions for his service, and had even inquired about his family during informal encounters. Her genuine warmth and apparent integrity had earned her the loyalty of many palace staff members. The captain found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to remain neutral in family disputes, but he also had a responsibility to prevent any actions that might harm members of the royal family. If Queen Consort Isabella was indeed planning something that could damage Princess Catherine's reputation or position, William felt he needed to be prepared to intervene if necessary. As Isabella and Margaret concluded their conversation and headed toward the archive offices, William made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He would discreetly investigate the situation himself, ensuring that proper protocols were being followed and that no member of the royal family was being subjected to unwarranted scrutiny or potential harm. The morning sun was now fully illuminating the palace grounds, casting long shadows through the tall windows. What had started as a routine day was about to become anything but ordinary. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test loyalties, challenge traditions, and potentially change the dynamics within the royal family forever. Isabella's determination to protect her son's interests, Catherine's apparent research into succession matters, and William's growing concern about the situation were all converging toward an inevitable clash. The ancient walls of Ashworth Palace, which had witnessed centuries of royal drama, were about to bear witness to another chapter in the complex saga of power, ambition, and family loyalty that defined life within the monarchy. 3 days had passed since Isabella's conversation with Lady Margaret, and the Queen Consort had spent every waking moment developing her strategy. The information gathered by Margaret from young Thomas Hartwell had been both illuminating and deeply concerning. Catherine had indeed accessed highly sensitive documents, including records of previous succession disputes, cases where royal marriages had been annulled, and most troubling of all, historical precedents for removing individuals from the line of succession. Isabella sat in her private study, a richly appointed room overlooking the palace gardens, where she conducted her most confidential business. The morning light filtered through heavy velvet curtains as she reviewed the detailed notes Margaret had compiled. Each revelation seemed to confirm her worst suspicions about Catherine's true motives. According to Thomas Hartwell's account, Catherine had spent several hours studying a particular case from 2 centuries earlier where a royal consort had successfully challenged the legitimacy of stepchildren's claims to inheritance. The case had involved complex questions about marriage contracts, adoption procedures, and the rights of children from previous unions. The parallels to Isabella's own situation with Prince Marcus were unmistakable. "She's more cunning than I gave her credit for," Isabella murmured to herself as she studied the documents. Catherine's public persona as a devoted wife and caring stepmother to Marcus had apparently been masking a calculated effort to strengthen her own future children's position in the succession. The research suggested that Catherine might be building a case to challenge Marcus's legitimacy as a true heir to the throne. Lady Margaret entered the study carrying a silver tea service, her expression grave. "Your Majesty, I've received additional information that you need to hear immediately." Isabella set down the papers and fixed her attention on her trusted advisor. Margaret's tone suggested that whatever news she bore was of the utmost seriousness. "I've learned that Princess Catherine met privately with Lord Chancellor Whitmore yesterday evening," Margaret continued as she poured the tea. "The meeting lasted over 2 hours and took place in his private chambers, not in any official capacity. Lord Chancellor Whitmore was the kingdom's most senior legal advisor and the ultimate authority on constitutional matters, including succession law. For Catherine to meet with him privately, outside of normal royal protocol, suggested that her research had progressed beyond mere academic interest to active legal consultation." Isabella felt her blood pressure rising. "Did we learn anything about the nature of their discussion?" "Not directly, But Lord Whitmore's personal secretary mentioned to one of the kitchen staff that the Chancellor had requested several volumes of constitutional law from his private library after the meeting, books specifically dealing with royal succession and legitimacy challenges. The implications were staggering. If Catherine was working with the Lord Chancellor to build a legal framework for challenging Marcus's position, she was far more dangerous than Isabella had initially realized. This wasn't merely about gaining influence or securing her own position. It was a direct assault on Isabella's son's birthright. Isabella rose from her chair and began pacing the room, her mind racing through possible responses. She had always prided herself on being several steps ahead of her opponents in the complex game of royal politics, but Catherine had managed to conduct her research and legal consultations with remarkable discretion. The princess had clearly learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court intrigue more skillfully than anyone had anticipated. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Margaret said hesitantly. "I believe we may have been discovered." Isabella stopped pacing abruptly. "What do you mean?" Captain Blackwood approached Thomas Hartwell yesterday morning and asked detailed questions about who had been accessing the archives recently. Thomas said the captain seemed particularly interested in Princess Catherine's visits and asked specific questions about which documents she had reviewed. This development added an entirely new dimension to the situation. Captain Blackwood's investigation suggested that someone else had noticed Catherine's activities and was conducting their own inquiry. But whose side was the captain on? Was he investigating Catherine on behalf of another party, or was he attempting to protect her from Isabella's scrutiny? Isabella had always found William Blackwood difficult to read. Unlike many court officials who wore their loyalties and ambitions openly, the captain maintained a professional distance that made his true feelings about various members of the royal family unclear. His reputation for integrity and fairness was well established, but those very qualities could make him an unpredictable factor in the current situation. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Isabella decided. "If Captain Blackwood is investigating, it's only a matter of time before our activities come to light. I want concrete evidence of what Catherine is planning before she has a chance to implement whatever scheme she's developing." Margaret nodded but looked troubled. "Your Majesty, if I may speak freely, we're entering dangerous territory. Direct confrontation with Princess Catherine could have serious consequences, especially if King Edmund is indeed supporting her research." Isabella had considered this possibility, and it was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire situation. If Edmund was actively collaborating with Catherine to alter the succession, Isabella would be fighting not just against her daughter-in-law, but against the reigning monarch himself. Such a battle could easily destroy her own position within the royal family and potentially harm Marcus's future prospects even more than Catherine's current activities. However, Isabella had not survived decades of court politics by backing down from difficult confrontations. She had learned long ago that allowing potential threats to develop unchallenged was far more dangerous than addressing them directly, even if the immediate consequences were unpleasant. "Margaret, I want you to arrange a meeting with Prince Marcus this afternoon. He needs to understand what's at stake and be prepared to defend his own interests if necessary." Prince Marcus, now 28 years old, had always been somewhat naive about palace politics. Unlike his stepbrother Alexander, who had grown up understanding the complexities of royal succession from an early age, Marcus had been allowed to pursue his interests in military history and archaeological research with relatively little preparation for the political realities of his position. Isabella realized she might have made an error in sheltering him from these concerns, but there was no time for regrets now. As Margaret left to arrange the meeting with Marcus, Isabella turned her attention to developing a more comprehensive strategy. She needed allies within the court who could provide additional intelligence about Catherine's activities and, if necessary, support Isabella's position if the conflict became public. Her first thought was of Duke Harrison Pembroke, an influential nobleman who had served as King Edmund's close advisor for many years. The Duke had always maintained cordial relations with Isabella, and had occasionally expressed concerns about the rapid changes in court dynamics since Catherine's arrival. He might be receptive to Isabella's perspective on the current situation. There was also Lady Victoria Ashford, the Queen Mother's former lady-in-waiting, who still wielded considerable influence among the older generation of court officials. Lady Victoria had never fully accepted Catherine's integration into the royal family, and might welcome an opportunity to support traditional succession principles. Isabella spent the next hour composing carefully worded messages to both potential allies, hinting at her concerns without revealing the full extent of her knowledge or intentions. The art of court politics required delicate balance between transparency and discretion, and Isabella had mastered this balance through years of experience. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Captain William Blackwood was conducting his own investigation with growing concern. His inquiries had confirmed that something unusual was happening within the royal family, but he was still unclear about the exact nature of the conflict or which parties posed the greatest threat to stability. William had served long enough to recognize the signs of brewing political crisis: the hushed conversations, the private meetings, the careful maneuvering for position, all indicated that a significant confrontation was approaching. His primary concern was ensuring that, whatever happened, it wouldn't compromise the security or dignity of the monarchy itself. The captain had made a decision to increase security protocols around all members of the royal family without drawing attention to his actions. He had also begun quietly documenting the various meetings and activities he observed, creating a record that might prove valuable if formal investigations became necessary. As the afternoon approached, the various players in this complex drama were positioning themselves for what was beginning to look like an inevitable confrontation. Isabella's determination to protect Marcus's interests, Catherine's apparent challenge to traditional succession arrangements, and William's growing concern about maintaining stability were all on a collision course that would test the very foundations of the royal family's unity. The afternoon meeting between Isabella and Prince Marcus took place in the Queen Consort's private salon, away from the prying eyes and ears that seemed to be everywhere in the palace these days. Marcus arrived precisely at the appointed time, his tall frame filling the doorway as he entered with the casual confidence that had always characterized his demeanor. At 28, he possessed the classical good looks of his father's lineage combined with his mother's sharp intelligence, though he had never fully appreciated the political implications of his royal position. "Mother, you sounded quite urgent in your message," Marcus said as he settled into the chair across from Isabella's desk. "Is everything all right with the family?" Isabella studied her son's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression. Marcus had always been refreshingly straightforward in his dealings with others, a quality that served him well in his military and academic pursuits, but left him vulnerable in the treacherous world of court politics. She realized that what she was about to tell him would fundamentally change his understanding of his place within the royal family. "Marcus, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to share with you. And I need you to understand that this information must remain absolutely confidential until we decide how to proceed," Isabella began, her voice carrying the weight of maternal protectiveness mixed with political urgency. Over the next hour, Isabella systematically laid out everything she had discovered about Catherine's activities. She showed him the detailed notes Margaret had compiled, explained the significance of the documents Catherine had accessed, and described the private meeting with Lord Chancellor Whitmore. Throughout her presentation, Isabella watched her son's expression change from mild curiosity to growing concern, and finally to barely contained anger. "You're telling me that Catherine has been secretly researching ways to remove me from the line of succession?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "But why? I've always treated her with nothing but respect and affection. I genuinely considered her a friend, not just my stepmother." Isabella felt a pang of sadness at her son's words. Marcus had indeed embraced Catherine as a family member from the beginning, welcoming her into their lives with the same openness he had always shown to those around him. His genuine nature had made it impossible for him to see Catherine's actions as anything other than innocent research until now. "I'm afraid that your personal relationship with Catherine may have blinded you to her political calculations," Isabella said gently. "Remember, she comes from a world where advancement required careful planning and strategic thinking. Those skills that helped her rise to become a princess don't simply disappear once she achieves royal status." Marcus stood and began pacing the room, much as his mother had done earlier that morning. "But what about Alexander? Surely he can't be aware of what his wife is planning. He would never allow Catherine to harm family relationships like this." This question touched on one of Isabella's deepest concerns. Prince Alexander's loyalty to his wife was absolute, and his political instincts were far more developed than his stepbrother's. If Catherine had convinced Alexander that changes to the succession were necessary for the good of the monarchy, he might support her efforts regardless of the impact on Marcus. "We can't assume that Alexander is unaware," Isabella replied carefully. It's possible that he and Catherine have discussed this privately and reached their own conclusions about what's best for the kingdom's future. We need to be prepared for the possibility that they're working together on this. The implications of this possibility were staggering. Alexander was the heir apparent and would one day be king. If he and Catherine were actively working to marginalize Marcus's position, they had the future power of the crown behind their efforts. Isabella realized that time was running out to protect her son's interests. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face his mother directly. What exactly are you proposing we do about this situation? Isabella had been considering this question for days, weighing various options and their potential consequences. Direct confrontation with Catherine risked exposing their knowledge of her activities before they fully understood her plans. Approaching King Edmund could backfire spectacularly if he was indeed supporting Catherine's research, but taking no action seemed increasingly dangerous as Catherine's legal consultations progressed. I believe we need to gather more definitive evidence of Catherine's intentions before we can make any decisive moves, Isabella said. But we also need to begin building our own support within the court. If this becomes a public dispute about succession rights, we'll need influential allies who understand the importance of maintaining traditional protocols. Before Marcus could respond, a soft knock at the salon door interrupted their conversation. Lady Margaret entered with an expression of barely controlled alarm that immediately put both Isabella and Marcus on high alert. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but I have urgent news that cannot wait, Margaret said, glancing nervously between mother and son. Captain Blackwood has requested an immediate private audience with you. He said it concerns matters of family security that require your immediate attention. Isabella felt her heart rate quicken. Captain Blackwood's request could mean several things, none of them particularly welcome. He might have discovered their surveillance of Catherine and intended to warn them about overstepping boundaries. Alternatively, he might have uncovered something about Catherine's activities that posed an even greater threat than they had realized. There was also the possibility that he had been directed by King Edmund or Prince Alexander to investigate Isabella's own actions. Did the captain give any indication of the nature of his concerns? Isabella asked. No, Your Majesty, but he did mention that time was of critical importance, and that delay could result in serious complications for all parties involved. Marcus looked at his mother with growing apprehension. Mother, what if Captain Blackwood has been investigating us? What if Catherine has already discovered our activities and reported them? This possibility had occurred to Isabella, and it was among her worst-case scenarios. If Catherine had indeed become aware of the surveillance and had involved palace security, Isabella could find herself accused of conduct unbecoming a member of the royal family. Such accusations, even if ultimately proven unfounded, could permanently damage her reputation and influence within the court. We'll need to meet with Captain Blackwood and determine exactly what he knows, Isabella decided. But Marcus, before we do that, I need you to understand something crucial. Whatever happens in the coming days or weeks, your position as a legitimate member of this royal family is not negotiable. You have rights and privileges that cannot be simply swept aside by political maneuvering. Marcus nodded solemnly, but Isabella could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The comfortable world he had known, where family relationships were straightforward and his future seemed secure, was crumbling around him. She felt a surge of maternal protective instinct mixed with rage at Catherine for creating this situation. Should I remain here for the meeting with Captain Blackwood? Marcus asked. Isabella considered this question carefully. Marcus's presence might demonstrate family unity and resolve, but it could also complicate the discussion if Captain Blackwood had sensitive information to share. Additionally, if the captain was indeed investigating their activities, it might be better for Isabella to handle the initial conversation alone. I think it would be best if I meet with him privately first, Isabella decided. Depending on what he has to say, we may need to include you in subsequent discussions. As Margaret left to inform Captain Blackwood that the Queen Consort would see him shortly, Isabella turned to her son one final time. Marcus, I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that our family dynamics are about to change dramatically. Whatever Catherine has planned and whatever support she might have from other family members, we cannot allow your rightful position to be undermined without a fight. Marcus embraced his mother briefly, a gesture that conveyed both his gratitude for her protection and his growing understanding of the serious nature of their situation. As he left the salon, Isabella took a few moments to compose herself for what could prove to be the most important conversation of this entire affair. Captain William Blackwood represented an unknown factor in an already complex situation. His reputation for integrity and fairness was well established, but Isabella wasn't certain whether those qualities would work in her favor or against her. If he had discovered evidence of wrongdoing on anyone's part, his duty would require him to report it regardless of the political consequences. Isabella straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever revelations Captain Blackwood might bring. The game of royal politics was entering a new and potentially dangerous phase, and she was determined to protect her son's interests regardless of the personal cost. Captain William Blackwood entered Queen Consort Isabella's private salon with the measured stride that had characterized his 15 years of service to the royal family. His dress uniform was immaculate as always, but Isabella noticed a tension in his bearing that was unusual for the typically composed officer. As head of the Royal Guard, William had faced numerous security challenges and diplomatic crises, but something about his current demeanor suggested this meeting would be unlike any previous interaction they had shared. "Your Majesty," William said, offering a respectful bow before taking the seat Isabella indicated. "I appreciate you agreeing to see me on such short notice. The matter I need to discuss with you is both urgent and highly sensitive." Isabella maintained her composure despite the anxiety building within her. "Captain Blackwood, you mentioned that this concerns family security. Please, speak freely." William hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Your Majesty, in the course of my regular security duties, I have become aware of activities within the palace that concern me greatly. I believe there may be threats to the stability and unity of the royal family that require immediate attention." Isabella's mind raced through possibilities. Was William about to reveal that he had discovered her surveillance of Catherine, or had he uncovered something even more damaging about Catherine's plans? The captain's careful phrasing suggested he was trying to convey serious concerns without overstepping his authority. "What specific activities have caused you concern, Captain?" Isabella asked, deciding that a direct approach would serve her better than attempting to guess at his knowledge. William straightened in his chair, his expression becoming even more serious. "Your Majesty, I have observed Princess Catherine accessing restricted areas of the palace archives on multiple occasions without following proper security protocols. More concerning, I have evidence that she has been photographing confidential documents using a concealed camera device." Isabella felt a shock of surprise mixed with validation. Her suspicions about Catherine's activities had been correct, but the revelation that Catherine was actually photographing documents suggested a level of premeditation that was far more serious than mere research. Photographing confidential royal documents could be considered a form of espionage, depending on what Catherine planned to do with the images. "Are you certain about the photographing?" Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, Your Majesty. I personally witnessed Princess Catherine using what appeared to be a sophisticated miniature camera to photograph pages from succession law documents 3 days ago. The device was concealed within what looked like an ordinary royal seal, but I observed the actual photographing process from a concealed position." This revelation changed everything. Isabella had been prepared to confront Catherine about research and legal consultations, but photographing royal documents suggested that Catherine might be planning to share sensitive information with outside parties. The implications for royal security and family stability were enormous, William continued. "I have also documented several meetings between Princess Catherine and individuals who are not part of the usual royal advisory circle. These meetings have taken place in private locations within the palace, and the participants have gone to considerable lengths to avoid being observed by regular security personnel." Isabella leaned forward in her chair. "Who were these individuals?" "I have identified at least 3 people. A constitutional lawyer from London who specializes in succession disputes, a private investigator who has worked on several high-profile inheritance cases, and most troubling, a journalist who covers royal affairs for several international publications." The mention of a journalist sent a chill through Isabella. If Catherine was working with media representatives, it suggested that she might be planning to make her succession challenge public rather than handling it through internal family channels. A public dispute about royal succession could be catastrophic for the monarchy's reputation and stability. "Captain Blackwood, have you shared this information with anyone else?" Isabella asked. No, Your Majesty. I came to you first because I believe you have the most to lose if Princess Catherine's activities continue unchecked. I also wanted to understand if you were aware of these developments before determining my next steps. Isabella realized that Captain Blackwood was offering her an opportunity to address the situation before it escalated further. His loyalty to the royal family as an institution was compelling him to seek a resolution that would minimize damage to the monarchy, even if it meant bypassing normal reporting procedures. Captain, I must be honest with you. I have been concerned about some of Princess Catherine's activities for several weeks, though I wasn't aware of the extent of what you've discovered. I have been conducting my own discreet inquiries, but nothing approaching the level of evidence you've presented. William nodded gravely. Your Majesty, I believe we are facing a crisis that could fundamentally damage the royal family, if not handled immediately and decisively. Princess Catherine appears to be building a comprehensive legal and public relations campaign to challenge traditional succession arrangements. Isabella stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, her mind working through the implications of William's revelations. Catherine's activities were far more sophisticated and potentially damaging than she had initially realized. The involvement of outside lawyers, investigators, and journalists suggested that Catherine was preparing for a coordinated assault on the current succession structure. What do you recommend, Captain? Isabella asked, turning back to face William. Your Majesty, I believe we need to confront Princess Catherine directly and demand an immediate explanation of her activities. If she cannot provide satisfactory justification for her actions, particularly the photographing of confidential documents, then we may need to consider restricting her access to sensitive areas of the palace. Isabella considered this proposal carefully. Direct confrontation with Catherine carried significant risks, especially if Catherine had indeed built relationships with media representatives who might publicize any family conflict. However, allowing Catherine's activities to continue seemed even more dangerous given what William had discovered. There's another factor we need to consider, Isabella said. We don't know the extent of Prince Alexander's knowledge or involvement in his wife's activities. Confronting Catherine without understanding Alexander's position could create additional complications. William's expression became even more troubled. Your Majesty, I'm afraid I have reason to believe that Prince Alexander may indeed be aware of at least some of his wife's activities. Yesterday evening, I observed him meeting privately with the same constitutional lawyer who had met with Princess Catherine earlier in the week. This news hit Isabella like a physical blow. If both Alexander and Catherine were working with legal experts to challenge succession arrangements, it meant that the future king himself was actively participating in efforts that could harm Marcus's position. The situation had evolved far beyond a simple family dispute into something approaching a constitutional crisis. Captain Blackwood, given the seriousness of what you've discovered, I believe we need to act quickly but carefully. I propose that we arrange for a private meeting with Princess Catherine tomorrow morning. We'll present her with the evidence of her activities and demand a full explanation of her intentions. William nodded his agreement. I think that's the appropriate next step, Your Majesty. However, we should be prepared for the possibility that Princess Catherine may refuse to cooperate or may attempt to escalate the situation by involving outside parties. Isabella had already considered this possibility. If Catherine chose to make the conflict public through her media contacts, the royal family would face the kind of scandal that could take years to recover from. The British press had always shown intense interest in royal family disputes, and a succession controversy involving accusations of document theft and political maneuvering would dominate headlines for months. We'll also need to consider whether to inform King Edmund about the situation, Isabella said. As the reigning monarch, he has the ultimate authority to resolve succession disputes, but we don't know whether he's already been influenced by Catherine and Alexander's research. This question represented perhaps the most delicate aspect of the entire situation. King Edmund's position on succession matters would ultimately determine the outcome of any formal dispute. If Catherine had already convinced him that changes were necessary, Isabella and Marcus would find themselves fighting against the full power of the crown. I recommend that we speak with Princess Catherine first, William suggested. Depending on her responses and attitude, we can then determine whether to involve His Majesty immediately or to seek additional evidence and support before escalating to that level. Isabella agreed with this approach. The meeting with Catherine would likely determine whether the situation could be resolved quietly within the family or whether it would evolve into a full-scale political and constitutional crisis. Either way, Isabella was determined to protect Marcus's interests and ensure that traditional succession principles were respected. As Captain Blackwood prepared to leave, Isabella felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. His willingness to bring these concerns to her attention had provided crucial intelligence about Catherine's activities, but it had also confirmed her worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the threat facing Marcus's position. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test not only family loyalties, but also the fundamental principles that governed royal succession. Isabella knew that the next 24 hours would likely determine the future of her son's place within the royal family, and possibly the stability of the monarchy itself. The confrontation that would change the course of royal family history began at precisely 9 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. Princess Catherine arrived at the East Wing archives, as had become her routine over the past several weeks, unaware that her activities had been carefully documented and that a reckoning awaited her. She carried her usual leather portfolio and wore the confident expression of someone who believed her actions remained undetected. Isabella had positioned herself in the main archival reading room with Captain William Blackwood stationed at the entrance. They had agreed that William would initially remain in the background, allowing Isabella to attempt a diplomatic resolution before revealing the full extent of their knowledge about Catherine's activities. The Queen Consort's heart was pounding, but years of court politics had taught her to maintain a composed exterior regardless of internal turmoil. "Catherine, how fortunate to encounter you here," Isabella said with carefully controlled pleasantness as the princess entered the reading room. "I was hoping we might have an opportunity to speak privately about your recent historical research." Catherine's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of wariness crossing her features before she recovered her composure. "Of course, Isabella. I'm always happy to discuss my work on royal history and constitutional development. It's fascinating to trace how succession laws have evolved over the centuries." Isabella studied Catherine's face carefully, noting the slight tension around her eyes despite her conversational tone. "Yes, I understand you've been particularly interested in cases involving challenges to traditional inheritance arrangements. Quite specialized research for someone with your background? I believe it's important for all members of the royal family to understand the legal and historical foundations of our positions," Catherine replied smoothly. "Knowledge of precedent can help us better serve the monarchy and the people." The diplomatic dance continued for several minutes, with both women maintaining surface politeness while probing for information about each other's true intentions. Isabella found herself reluctantly impressed by Catherine's composure under pressure, though this only reinforced her concerns about the princess's potential threat to Marcus's interests. Finally, Isabella decided that subtlety was no longer serving her purposes. "Catherine, I think we need to have a more direct conversation about your activities. I'm aware that you've been accessing highly sensitive succession documents and meeting with constitutional lawyers without following proper royal protocols." Catherine's mask of pleasant cooperation slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of anger that she quickly suppressed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Isabella, but my research has been conducted with appropriate respect for palace procedures and family interests." "Including your meetings with journalists and private investigators?" Isabella asked, watching Catherine's face carefully for her reaction. This time, Catherine couldn't entirely hide her shock at the extent of Isabella's knowledge. Her pause before responding lasted just long enough to confirm that the accusations were accurate, though she attempted to recover with a show of indignation. "I don't know where you're getting your information, but I resent the implication that I would engage in anything inappropriate or harmful to the family," Catherine said, her voice rising slightly. It was at this moment that Captain William Blackwood stepped forward from his position near the entrance, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. Catherine's eyes widened as she recognized the implications of the Royal Guard's involvement in what she had assumed was a private family dispute. "Princess Catherine," William said formally, "I have personally witnessed you photographing confidential royal documents on multiple occasions. These actions represent a serious breach of palace security protocols and potentially constitute unauthorized access to state information." Catherine's composure finally cracked completely. The revelation that her activities had been under professional surveillance rather than just family suspicion clearly stunned her. For several long moments, she simply stared at Captain Blackwood without speaking, her mind apparently racing through the implications of his statement. "I can explain everything," Catherine finally said, but her voice lacked the confidence she had maintained throughout the earlier part of the conversation. "My research was intended to protect the monarchy, not to harm it." Isabella stepped closer to Catherine, her own mask of diplomacy finally falling away to reveal the full extent of her anger and determination. "Protect it from what exactly? From my son's legitimate claim to his inheritance? From traditional succession laws that have served this country for centuries?" Catherine's defensive posture suddenly shifted to something approaching defiance. "From outdated systems that don't reflect the realities of modern monarchy," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Marcus's claim to succession is based on marriages and arrangements that occurred when the world was completely different. The kingdom needs leadership that understands contemporary challenges, not someone whose primary qualification is having the right bloodline from previous generations." Isabella felt a surge of rage at Catherine's words, but she forced herself to maintain control. This was the confirmation she had been seeking. Catherine was indeed actively working to undermine Marcus's position, and was prepared to justify her actions with arguments about modernization and reform. "So you admit that you've been working to challenge my son's place in the succession," Isabella stated. Catherine straightened her shoulders, apparently deciding that further deception was pointless. "I admit that I've been researching legal precedents that might support necessary changes to how this monarchy operates. Alexander and I believe that the royal family needs to evolve with the times, and that includes reconsidering inheritance arrangements that no longer serve the kingdom's best interests." The reference to Alexander's involvement confirmed Isabella's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy against Marcus. If the future king was actively supporting efforts to marginalize his stepbrother, the situation was even more serious than she had realized. Captain Blackwood stepped forward again. "Princess Catherine, I must inform you that photographing confidential royal documents without authorization is a serious offense that cannot be overlooked regardless of your stated intentions. I'm going to have to ask you to surrender any photographic equipment you may have with you, and to provide a complete accounting of all documents you have accessed improperly." Catherine looked between Isabella and Captain Blackwood, clearly recognizing that her position had become untenable. "I want to speak with Alexander immediately. As my husband and the heir to the throne, he should be present for any formal accusations or proceedings." "That can be arranged," Isabella said coldly. "But first, you're going to explain exactly what you and Alexander have planned for Marcus's future within this family." Catherine's response was interrupted by the arrival of Prince Alexander himself, who had apparently been summoned by palace staff who had observed the unusual gathering in the archives. His expression was grim as he took in the scene, his wife facing accusations from his stepmother while the head of the royal guard stood witness to the confrontation. "What exactly is happening here?" Alexander demanded, his voice carrying the authority of his position as heir apparent. Isabella turned to face her stepson, noting the protective stance he immediately took beside his wife. "Alexander, we've discovered that Catherine has been secretly photographing confidential royal documents and working with outside lawyers and journalists to build a case against Marcus's succession rights. We need to know the extent of your involvement in these activities." Alexander's face hardened as he processed the accusations. "My involvement is exactly what you might expect from a husband whose wife is being subjected to surveillance and accusations by family members who should be offering support and trust." The battle lines were now clearly drawn. Alexander and Catherine stood united against Isabella, and by extension, Marcus's interests. Captain Blackwood found himself in the middle of a family conflict that threatened to tear apart the royal household and potentially damage the monarchy itself. "Alexander," Isabella said, her voice carrying both hurt and determination, "Marcus has always loved and respected you as his brother. How can you justify actions that would harm his future for the sake of political considerations?" Alexander's response would determine whether this confrontation could be resolved within the family or whether it would escalate into a full constitutional crisis that could shake the foundations of the kingdom itself. The ancient walls of Ashworth Palace had witnessed many royal dramas over the centuries, but few had carried such potential for lasting damage to the institution of monarchy. As the four individuals faced each other in the archival reading room, surrounded by centuries of royal history and precedent, the future of the royal family hung in the balance. The decisions made in the next few moments would determine not only Marcus's fate, but also whether the traditions and stability that had defined the monarchy could survive the challenges of modern political realities.